The best place to start is exactly where you are and have a really good understanding of what your situation is. Because when we talk about pay transparency, I think sometimes, it can be really easy to think it's all about everybody sharing their salary to the whole world and there's no privacy. But it doesn't actually work like that. There's actually a spectrum. And so you start from, there's no conversation about pay at all, and there's no transparency around how decisions are made, all the way right through to there is complete transparency within the organisation. I've had, some leaders who have not been so great and others who have been great. But the greatest one that I ever had was somebody who just trusted me implicitly that I would figure things out, that I'd be able to do the job, I'd be able to, come up with new innovative ideas, and that sense of freedom to just try things out, even if I wasn't sure.
Today's episode of the HR L&D Podcast is sponsored by Deal. Now, take a moment, if you would, to consider the following pre-show scenario. Imagine you had to visit 16 houses just to cook your dinner. One place has the pots, another has the pans, another has the stove, and another has the food. You get the idea. Sounds ridiculous, right? Well, the reality is most global businesses operate exactly the same way, using 16 different tools and platforms to hire, manage, and pay their workforce. But now there's one platform that does it all, and that's today's sponsor. That's Deal. That's DEEL. And Deal is the all-in-one platform built for global work. So whether you're an enterprise business, a small company, or something in between, from automated onboarding to performance assessments and beyond, you can manage the entire worker lifecycle all under one roof. Hire and onboard talent in over 150 countries, or run payroll in over 100 countries. Even offer competitive benefits, equity, and equipment. With Deal's industry-leading suite of HR tools, payroll solutions, and compliance services, you can scale globally with unmatched speed and expertise. So are you ready to transform your global HR system? If you are, click in the link in the show notes to book a demo with Deal today. That's DEEL. Hello and welcome back to the HR L&D podcast. I hope it's your go-to place for HR insights and people management insights and expertise from the guests that we bring, because today I'm bringing you a fantastic guest and we're going to be talking about the value of pay transparency in HR. Now, for those who don't know me, my name is Nick Day. I'm CEO of the Global HR Recruitment Firm, JGA Recruitment. And in today's episode, as I mentioned, we're tackling what I think is a pivotal issue at the heart of modern HR practices. And that is why it pays for HR directors to develop a pay transparency plan. The person to help us navigate that today is Michelle Gyimah, a seasoned expert in pay gaps and financial coaching with a commendable 15-year track record working with some massive industry leaders in this space. Michelle has been instrumental in guiding organizations towards more equitable workplaces by implementing effective pay transparency strategies. And that's what we're going to be talking about on today's show. She's also the host of her very own podcast called Beyond the Pay Gap, Figure Podcast. And if you're interested in that, there will be a link in the show notes. So do check that out if you want to find out more. And she's also dedicated to providing insights and strategies for HR teams to navigate and improve pay equity discussions. Michelle, it's a pleasure to have you shed us some light on this crucial and critical topic today. So welcome to the HR L&D podcast. How are you feeling?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I'm excited to delve into the subject today.
Yeah, you and me both. Let's start with the first question then before we get into the detail. A question I ask all of my guests, which is this: what do the words human resources mean to you?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think for me, the thing that stands out is the resources aspect. For me, it's always, when I think of HR and I think back to my time, in the workplace, it's always about thinking about how can I utilize the team for the things that I need in terms of, progressing my career or navigating any issues that I might be having. And I think sometimes that gets lost, that they are there to be a resource for us in the workplace. So for me, I kind of focus on the resource aspect in terms of them being there to support me with whatever issues I might be experiencing that's impacting on work.
Super. And presumably it's a resource that you must lean into quite regularly in the work that you do. Is your sort of predominant client base working with HR leaders, HR directors, and HR professionals, or do you have other clients outside of the HR remit as well that you'd work with?
I would say that 90% of the people that I work with are, within the human resources teams, whether they're the HR manager, HR director. Sometimes, though, I will work with DEI leads or learning and development leads as well, but it's mainly going to be HR focused because they are the people that are very often responsible for writing their pay gaps, pulling together the action plan and rolling out all of the implementation that goes with it as well.
Super. I couldn't agree more. So let's get into the detail then of what we're going to be talking about today. Why do you think developing a pay transparency plan is crucial for HR directors? Why do you think those listening to this show right now really need to dive into this and lean into it for their organizations?
Yeah, well, I think it's a natural progression in terms of what we're seeing employees expecting from employers today. So, for example, we have had here in the UK pay gap reporting since 2017. Before then, it was an unknown thing. There was definitely a lot of nervousness around starting to have this conversation and having this information being put out there year after year. And we're now in a place where some organizations are still very uncomfortable about that because, the data might not be great, but it's become a topic that isn't taboo anymore. It's become a topic that's not very niche anymore, and it's not secretive. And so part of that journey has meant that, this topic is now opening up. So these are issues that have been, a problem for employees for the longest time. But we're now in a position where, because we're kind of used to talking about pay gaps, the next kind of evolution around that is around pay transparency as well. And I think given the world of work that we live in now, given, the global pandemic that we have been through and the aftermath of that, given all of the kind of like social justice upheavals that we are seeing, we now have, a kind of generation of people who are starting to ask more questions of their workplaces and more questions of their employers. And the issues around pay transparency and pay equity and social justice in of itself is now like a really high priority for so many employees. And so even though you might be sat there thinking, well, we've never done anything around pay transparency before, we're just getting to grips with pay gaps and we don't want to kind of, do anything more, you need to kind of recognize that whilst this may be uncomfortable for you, it's imperative for your existing employees and your future employees as well. So the expectations in terms of the types of conversations that you're going to have and what you'll be transparent about are much, much higher. And if you are in the business of wanting to attract people and retain people, and who isn't, then this is going to be a topic that is super important for you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And obviously, I'm very well versed and immersed in the world of recruitment, and I know what people are asking for now. I know how that shift has really taken place in the world of work, where employees now looking for a new position have a lot more choice. We saw that with the Great Resignation. People decided actually if their companies weren't giving what they wanted, you know what, I'm going to go somewhere else, and they voted with their feet en masse. And I think now that social position of an organization, the values and behaviors that they not just write down on a board, but they actually embody, believe, and implement are really, really important now in that employee choice. And if you want to not just attract the top talent, but keep them with your organization, I think you need a transparent culture. I think it's great that there are so many benefits, commercial benefits in having a transparent culture within your organization, but it's also just a good thing to do, right? So irrespective of what those benefits might be in terms of the attraction and retention of staff, it's a good thing to be doing to put everyone on an equitable scale, so we can really look at our business in a different way, a holistic way, to say, how can we improve this and make sure that everyone feels that, psychologically safe in that environment, that they belong in this environment, and they can contribute as well. So I think that's really important. But it's a lot for HR people to manage at the moment. They're constantly plate spinning. They're managing loads of different things, from organizational change, HRIS software implementations, DEI initiatives, sustainability now. So, pay transparency is obviously another plate that's in the air for them. Where's the best place for them to start? What are the first steps they should take if they want to initiate a pay transparency plan within their companies?
Well, the best place to start is exactly where you are and have a really good understanding of what your situation is. Because when we talk about pay transparency, I think sometimes, it can be really easy to think it's all about everybody sharing their salary to the whole world and there's no privacy. But it doesn't actually work like that. There's actually a spectrum. And so you start from, there's no conversation about pay at all, and there's no transparency around how decisions are made, all the way right through to there is complete transparency within the organization, not necessarily in terms of people's names being revealed, but maybe the kind of job titles and grades. There's transparency around what that looks like, and so then you have everything in between. So in order for you to start thinking about this, you need to understand, well, where are you currently on that pay transparency spectrum? And then you can make a decision as to, well, where would you like to go? Because not every single organization wants to have complete transparency. You might want to be somewhere in the middle where people have an understanding of what the pay grades look like and what the kind of difference is, and then have some understanding around how an organization has decided this role, we're going to pay this much for this role. So it's really about looking inwards and deciding, well, what's best for this organization? Where do we sit now? What would we like to achieve? And then you need to kind of work backwards and say, okay, if we're at point, A, and we want to go to point C, what are the things that we need to be putting in place in order for that to happen? And also something that doesn't get kind of talked about very often, and I think is really important, is, and how do we educate people along this journey? How do we keep that communication going so that there is really good understanding of not only what we're trying to do, but why we're trying to do it and how we're doing it as well? Because there's nothing worse than announcing, yes, we are going to be a much more transparent organization. This is what we're trying to achieve. And then never having any conversations around the why and how it's going to happen and what to expect. Because naturally, this is going to bring up lots of questions. People are going to be a bit nervous, a bit reticent, like, oh, what does this mean? Does this mean that everybody's going to know my salary? Or, people naturally have questions. And so you need to be in a place where you're prepared for those questions, so you can anticipate them and you can help alleviate some of the fears that people have. You can do that myth busting, but also you can be giving really good information and saying, okay, this is misinformation. This is actually what is going to happen, or what we're attempting to do. So it's really about understanding where you are, where you want to go, and what your plan is to get there.
Sure. And we know there's always a little bit of resistance to any kind of change, whether that's what it does. If there's change and people's roles are going to, we're always slightly frightened of the unknown, right? So there's always going to be a little bit of resistance we have to manage. I think the education piece is an interesting one, and I'll come back to you in a moment to ask, what the best process is for educating them as we go on that journey. But a quote came to mind when you were talking, and it's actually, this is a quote that usually would align to an individual, but I think in this instance it works on a commercial scale, which is, those who look outward dream, those who look inward awaken. And I think in this instance, there's a lot of companies out there that are dreaming of having this great business that is everything or dancing. It's only when they look inward, though, that they really understand and uncover where some of their real issues lie. Now, we can take this into an individual level, but on a commercial level, of course, when we do actually take the time and have the inclination to really examine what's going on in our businesses, yes, it'll throw up questions, but questions allows us to raise awareness of what's really going on, to really find out what's driving and motivating our employees, to really find out if we are offering a transparent culture, a culture of equity and of diversity and of inclusion. So I think that came to mind when you were talking there, because I think sometimes there's a fear of looking inward because of what we might find. And I think that's the same on a personal level, right? It's why we often don't look inward. We use our egos to look outward. But I think it's the same in an organizational perspective. I think we need to overcome that fear, because the good thing about fear, sometimes it can lead us to action. And if we look inside, this is where we can create the beautiful businesses of the future. But as you say, one of the most important things then to achieve that is that educational journey. So how do we, you mentioned the word how, how do we go about doing that? As an HR professional listening to this, who's keen on putting a pay transparency plan in place, what's the best thing they can do to make sure they've got the education and that supports that initiative?
Yeah. And I agree with everything that you just said. The fear aspect is a real kind of stumbling block for a lot of organizations. And And, one of the things that I like to do is kind of question where that's come from and what is driving that. Because if you can understand that, then you're in a better place to understand what people's objections might be. And then you can start to unpack those fears. And sometimes those fears are valid, but maybe they're not as big as that person was thinking. All the fears are based on misinformation, which is why it's so important to be able to do that introspective work, at an organizational level and ask those questions. Okay, well, why are we resisting this? What is the real reason why we're not doing this? But in terms of thinking about that journey, okay, so you're an organization that's decided you want to be looking, at pay transparency within the organization. How do you make a start? The thing that I like to do the most with organizations is to use a framework. And it's a framework that I've called it the DISC framework. So that is that you have your data. So you need to know the information that's relevant to, what your pay transparency program or initiative is going to look like. So what do you already know about your company? So is it an organization that has been super secretive and now you're just kind of moving slightly to the rights where you're not so secretive? Or are you one that has some level of transparency, but maybe it's a bit ad hoc, it's a bit hit and miss? You don't have, specific objectives that everybody works to. So you're just looking to improve. So where are you? So what does your data, your own kind of pay transparency data about your organization say about you? And from that, you can get some insights. Like, what do you think people want to know? Have you got information to show that people have been leaving because nobody's equipped to have those conversations? Are they leaving for your competitors simply because they pay more? Or because, your competitors have a better kind of career progression strategy and people understand how they can move within an organization? So with your data, you need to delve into what insights can you pull together. And then you can then move on to your strategy. So what do you want to do? Which point of the pay spectrum, do you want to be at? And thinking about, okay, well, what does that mean? What are the steps in order for us to do that? So, for example, if you have never had a pay philosophy before, then you need to think about developing one. If you're in a situation where managers, they have a pot of money, but there's no guidance around how they decide that pot of money is divvied up for bonuses, promotions, etc., then you need to create something. And then when you come to the C within the DISC framework, that's around communication and connection. So how are you going to communicate the changes that are coming forward? So quite often that is going to be some form of training, some form of coaching. Talking about pay is not the easiest thing for people, but then when you couple that with having those conversations in the workplace, it brings up lots of emotions for people, and some will handle it really well and some may not. But if you're looking for that consistency across the organization, you need to ensure that you have something in place so that you can train up your line managers, that everybody's on the same page, they understand the objectives and how the frameworks actually work, so that you have that consistency. Because what you don't want is to have pockets of the organization that do this really well and then others that are not doing so well. You want to have that consistency of the career experience of people. So it's really about, being very intentional around those 4 points so that you can minimize the mistakes that you will make. And you will make mistakes, and that's part of the journey, but you want to be in a position where you're not making mistakes at the first hurdle and they're really big mistakes.
Sure.
And then, everybody's not feeling confident about what it is that you're doing, etc.
It sounds to me, not only that you're very passionate about this subject, Michelle, but also it looks to me like you've worked with organizations across all of those different challenges at different points. And obviously, I'm really interested because you've really niched here. In the work that you do as a pay gap equity consultant, that's really working with organizations to build transparency. And I'm a big fan of niching. So the recruitment agency, we have niches in payroll and HR, and you obviously niched in your area. But I'm fascinated to understand your story. So what was it that directed you, that gave you the motivation, the inspiration to follow your pathway into supporting organizations in this particular niche field? I'm intrigued to know.
Yeah, so it was by accident. So I was working at a government body called the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and their remit was to provide support and advice and guidance for employers, service providers, and educational establishments on anything to do with the Equality Act and the Human Rights Act. So essentially, it was helping organizations make sense of what the Equality Act says. And so I started out on the helpline providing advice for schools and universities. And then a job came up. It was actually a promotion. And the way that it worked then is that you would be interviewed on the skills that you had, and then you would be assigned a subject to work on. So I went for an interview, I was successful, and then I was told, oh, you've been given the topic of equal pay. And I was like, what? I'd never even heard of it. I didn't know anything about it. So excellent. I was very much learning on the job around equal pay and the pay gap. And I'll be really honest with you. At first, I was absolutely terrified of the subject because, as you can imagine, it was one of those topics that was very, very emotive, and people had all sorts of opinions about, equal pay and the pay gap. And this was before we even had pay gap reporting. And it took me quite a while to really lean into it and to start to enjoy it. And, and so now I'm in that place where I do enjoy it, so much so that I started my own business. But for me, it's a really fundamental piece around, people's career experiences. It's a fundamental piece for organizations in terms of HR and DEI. And I can see the potential that organizations could have if they were able to address this issue. So I moved from it being a subject that I'd never heard of to something that I
Wonderful.
really enjoy doing.
Oh, it's a really lovely story. And actually, I'm gonna lean into that then and ask you another question in just a moment, just to build on that. But credit to you for leaning in, because it is an emotive subject, right? There's a lot of links between financial wellness and mental health as well. And I think when you're dealing with any subject that impacts people's earnings, people's ability to earn, comparison is the thief of joy, right? We know we're dealing with pay. That is something that comes right to the surface. People are concerned that they may or may not be equitable, or that they feel like they're in the positive side of that. They don't want people to know. If on the negative side of it, they want to find out. So there's a lot of uncovering here that really dives into what makes us human, which I think is quite interesting on a psychological aspect. But what I really want to lean into then is, what are the benefits? What are the things that now you've taken that journey, you've seen all the positive sides of and outputs that can happen as a result of delivering a good pay transparency strategy? What are some of the benefits organizations can realize if they want to also start their journey in that direction, working with someone like yourself?
Yeah. So the first thing is that, your employees, they want to feel and know that they are valued. And, one of the quickest, fastest, easiest ways for them to measure that is knowing that they are being paid fairly. Now, obviously, the word fairly is, will mean different things to different people, depending on where you are in the world and sectors, etc. But, people want to feel that, and they also want to know that. And if you can be very proactive in that, you are much more likely to instill that real loyalty to you and the organization. Now, I'm not saying it's the only thing that you have to do, just pay people well. Obviously, you have to have a good culture where people are respected and valued and that they feel safe, etc. But knowing that the work that you do, the remuneration that you get for the work that you do is fair, goes a long way. And not only that, is, your employees are going to be your ambassadors. Whether you give them that title or not, they will talk about what it's like to work for you as an organization. So if you are an organization that takes, DEI seriously, all of the issues that come with that, then your employees are naturally going to be talking about what they like when it comes to working for your organization. And if you are open about maybe the challenges that you face, but the things that you are doing and putting in place to navigate those challenges, that's appealing to people as well. We're living in a time where we do have access to all of this information, and people are having conversations on all sorts of social media platforms. So it makes sense to be thinking about, well, what are our employees' experiences of working for us like? Where are the areas that we can improve, and how can we be very vocal about the improvements that we're trying to make? So for me, fundamentally, addressing pay equity, pay gaps, pay transparency work will make such a big difference to your ability to retain the best talent as well as attract the best talent. And the retention piece is really important because it costs, much more to have new people coming into the organization than it does to retain people. And so if you do,
absolutely does.
and you know that yourself, right?
Yeah, we do a lot of analysis on this, right? And it's a separate conversation completely in the world of recruitment, but you get a lot of TA or direct hire models that work in for businesses because they try and save at the front end. But if you get a poor hire, or you can't access the network that goes way deeper, or you can't access the passive talent, or even if you can access them, but you can't engage with them, then you can't necessarily recruit the best talent. And best talent isn't necessarily, as you said at the start of this with your interview, is not just about skills. It's about whether you are culturally aligned with the values and behaviors of that firm, right? And that's some of the work that we would do. But I think the cost that you think you're saving money at the front end, and then you realize that you've got a retention problem later on. And what happens is, sadly, is often then people will continue down that path. Well, now we've lost people, we need to save even more money. So actually you cut even more corners, and the problem gets worse when actually there is a potentially, in the world that I work in recruitment, there's a simpler solution. But it sounds like it's that theory translates into the world of work that you do. Something I'm interested to ask, because I think things like the gender pay gap changes that have come in are really, really progressive and where we were a couple of decades ago, right? And that's really good. But you, on your website, and I will direct people there on the show notes, but if those want to find it while they're following along, it's at equalitypays.co. And you've done a number of podcasts, obviously, on this subject, but you've done an interesting case study, which was talking about pay progression for women of color, fact or fiction. So I think it's great that we've got gender pay gap analysis, but does that go far enough? Because we know that, yes, there's a gender disparity, but there is also a person of color disparity and potentially a disability disparity. And that you can go further and further with this. But I would be really interested to understand some of the results of your case study and what you're seeing in the workplace. And are we being as progressive as sometimes the media would suggest that we are being, or actually have we still got an awful long way to go? Hello, HR and people leaders. Are you exhausted of the war for talent cliche? The problem is, when we hear a cliche, it usually exists for a reason. However, we think it's time for a fresh approach to the talent crisis. That's because at JGA Recruitment, we understand the real challenges you face in sourcing phenomenal HR and people candidates. And guess what? We think we have the solution. Our team is on a mission to revolutionize your hiring process. That's because we're not just recruiters. We're strategic partners dedicated to finding HR and people professionals who align perfectly with your company's vision and goals. So let's break the cycle of frustration together. Partner your talent acquisition strategies with JGA Recruitment and experience the difference in service, excellence, and results. No longer do you need to suffer the costs associated with a poor hire, because with over 100 5-star Google reviews and already trusted by many of the world's leading brands, why don't you take action today? Contact us at jgarecruitment.com to discover how we can help transform your HR and people teams. And here's a bonus. When you visit us, you can sign up for our weekly HR newsletter that's packed with invaluable industry insights and more. Let's revolutionize your HR talent acquisition strategies together and make the war for talent a cry from the past. Visit jjrecruitment.com to find out more.
Oh yes, the media. They have a lot to answer for, don't they? Yeah, and I think it's a really good question because, as you said, at the moment, pay gap reporting is simply around gender, and even that is, a very binary way of looking at things. But it's important to remember that, the pay gap itself has a lot of nuance. And then, the people's experiences of the pay gap is going to be different based on, different protected characteristics that they might have. So the case study that you're talking about is a report that I co-authored with the Runnymede Trust and the Fawcett Society, because what they wanted to do was they wanted to highlight the experience of women of colour in the UK. What was it like for them from the point of, leaving education, stepping into the workplace for the first time, all the way right through to exiting into self-employment, because, the gender pay gap as it is doesn't capture or doesn't allow for space to look at the differences between different ethnic groups, as it were. And so that's what this report was all about, was looking at, well, what does it look like for somebody who is a Bangladeshi woman? What does it look like for an African woman, or, a Caribbean woman, for people that were born in the UK, and then people who were born outside of the UK but moved into the workplace. And it was really fascinating to see the ways in which the bias and discrimination can creep in and can be different depending on the ethnic group that you belong to. So I think, and we're in a stage where there are calls to have ethnicity pay gap reporting as well. And I think the Labour government have committed to that if they were to get into power, that is one of the initiatives that they're going to be bringing in.
It seems to make sense from my perspective, because I think sometimes it's too easy to say it's just a gender pay gap that we need to work on. You could be a male of color, and there could still be disparity negatively against a white, Caucasian female, if you like. And I think sometimes we're looking at it from a perspective that's too binary, and it seems like a bit of an opportunity missed here, because it's not always that men are necessarily on average paid higher than women in that instance. Actually, we need to go deeper to really understand what's happening.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that's not a small task, but if we, if we want to make great strides, we have to start small and move forward, but we need to keep moving forward.
Yeah.
I thought that was a really interesting case study that you undertook. And of course, if people want to find out more, do go to the website. You can click and read through and find out more about that as well. So yeah, thanks for bringing some of that to our attention. So you mentioned some of the challenges that companies would face. I wonder if you've got any sort of examples of a particular challenge you've had to overcome in the work that you've done with organizations, and the subsequent positive results, why it was worth the effort, shall we say, to go through the hard times in order to get to the better side of pay transparency.
Yeah, so I think the example that springs to mind is around expectations. So there was one client that I was working with. They were in the engineering sector, and they've set themselves quite in my opinion, quite an ambitious, ambitious goal in terms of reducing their gender pay gap within a specific amount of time. And it was quite an interesting situation to be working with them, because they had really high expectations of me coming in and delivering some sessions on what the gender pay gap is, what it isn't, how it shows up in the workplace. And there was this hope that managers would just understand it, and then they'd be able to go off and kind of modify their behaviors and help, the organization reduce the pay gap. What the outcomes were was it then, so I did provide those sessions, but naturally, because we're dealing with, people, we're dealing with change in human behavior, I allow, people the opportunity to ask questions and to talk about what's happening, within the organization. And what came up was a real deep frustration around how the organization had put these plans together and the expectations that they had of line managers in helping the organization meet the goals that had been set. And so what came about was all of the issues that they could see on the ground, but they didn't feel that they were getting the support to be able to make the changes, even though there was a high expectation that this is their job and you have to help us, reduce the gender pay gap. And so there were quite a few tense conversations when I was feeding this information back to the senior leadership team, back to the HR team. And I felt that they felt disappointed that, people weren't just like, right, okay, we understand the gender pay gap now. We know what we have to do. We're off to do it. And so, we had to have quite a few conversations to explain that whilst it's okay for you to set these ambitious targets, you do need to think about, what are you putting in place to support people to make those changes? What are you putting in place to acknowledge the particular challenges that you have in the organization, the things that are not really working because of existing habits that have been done for so long, or because, there's somebody that's resistant to change. So there were times when I felt that was quite a tense kind of working relationship. But looking back now, I think it really was the best for them, because they were in a position of not really understanding what it really takes to make those pay gap changes, and not understanding the depth of work that is needed, but also the length of time that it takes for those changes to come into place. And for me, that's a common issue, that organizations think, okay, if we just do this one thing and this one thing over here, it will make the change. But we're asking people to be different. We're asking them to think differently, to make different choices, or to think their choices through in a much more coherent way. And so obviously that brings its own challenges, and organizations need to be prepared for how are they going to navigate that sticky middle before you see the outcomes that you're looking for.
Yeah, that's a really, really good example. And what brings to mind here is often organizations and individuals, we massively overestimate what we can achieve in 1 year, but we underestimate what we can achieve in 5. And I think if we get that bit right, that company now, I'm sure 5 years on, looking back, will go, wow, we've made huge strides here. But actually that first year, perhaps we were a little bit ambitious about some of the goals we can have, because it takes that sort of marginal gain approach of making lots of little changes. And over time, you have the whole result. So I think it was a really, really lovely example. One question, I think just to finish before we open the HR L&D vault, Michelle, was something that in your podcast, a wonderful show, may I add, so please do check that out. But there's a couple of times, or 2 or 3 times, you talk about the art of negotiation. And now this is obviously coming more from a candidate perspective, an employee perspective. So I always refer to candidates. I mean employees, of course, because it's the way that I work in my business. But there's an art to negotiation. But actually, there's a chicken and egg here, because one of your podcasts talks about how women are often penalized for negotiating. So I wondered if you could just expand on that, because we want to be able to negotiate equitable pay. And of course, we talked about fear earlier on in the show. We know that if people are going to be penalized for negotiating, then that's going to put them off, make them more fearful for taking that kind of course of action. So I wonder if you could just sort of bring that into the limelight a little bit and let us know about, in your experience, why it does pay to negotiate, but also some of the information you've got into why, on occasion, actually some women have been penalized for even taking that action. And maybe there's a better way of negotiating the process of negotiation, so to say.
Yeah, and that's a really good question to ask. So the episode was about the kind of downsides for women when it comes to trying to navigate this whole negotiation kind of conversation. And it came about because I used to teach negotiation skills, and so I've got really good insight into kind of the fears that people have around having the conversation. But when we talk about negotiation and women in particular, there's been so much information out there to say that women don't negotiate. They either never do it, or do it very rarely, or ask for very little. And for the longest time, that has been the narrative. But recent studies have actually shown that women negotiate just as much as men do, but the pushback they receive is much, much greater. And so that is where that kind of conundrum comes in. So that kind of flips it on its head. So instead of it being an individual problem, it shifts it to being a systemic problem in terms of how do people respond to women who are negotiating.
So potentially still a gender-based problem if we've got more men in senior positions, potentially.
Exactly. And then obviously we can think about, the ethnicity side as well, and possibly disability side as well. So that episode was around trying to kind of enlighten those people who have that kind of decision-making power around what it takes, the effort that it takes for people to actually have that conversation, but then to remind them that, they have a responsibility to ensure that their responses are objective and fair. And this goes back to the pay transparency piece. Now, I have raised this with quite a few clients, and I'll say to them, when it comes to negotiation, do you have any guidelines or objectives for managers to follow in terms of what they can and can't give to ensure that you're not exacerbating pay gaps, to ensure that you don't have an equal pay problem? And the answer 99% of the time has been no. And I've also, heard of managers will say, well, if somebody doesn't ask for more, I won't volunteer it because it means I'm saving the business money, and that makes me look good. And I'm sat there kind of going, oh, okay, yes, I can.
Yeah, that's going back to that small vision. Then eventually the employee who's fighting to say anything goes somewhere else, and you've got the problem of replacing, which is way more expensive than what a potentially small in comparison increase would have been. Because of course, it's not just the cost of replacing talent in terms of the financial costs involved, the time costs involved. It's that skill walking out the door, that training cost. It impacts businesses in so many ways, and it's a negative economy or false economy to think that you're saving your company business by taking that short-term view, because the longer-term view, and I know this in the world of recruitment, is if they're not happy, they'll move. And then you've got a much bigger problem on your hands.
Exactly. I mean, I can think of one example where I was working with an organization and I was talking to some of the individual women, and they had been told that they were being greedy for asking questions about the gender pay gap and trying to find out if their pay was being impacted by the pay gap. And what had happened was there were 3 or 4 women who would go to people within the HR team individually, and individually they were being told that they were being greedy. And then it was a chance conversation with each other when they said, oh, well, I went to such and such and mentioned this, and she said that I was greedy. And the other person says, oh, I had the same experience too. And, that in of itself already doesn't make the person think or feel that they want to be loyal to an organization, because who wants to be called greedy just for having, what's supposed to be an adult conversation about their pay and their career prospects. Nobody wants that. So, there's real risk for, women in particular in having this conversation, which is why I do believe that this is a systemic issue, that this is something that needs an onus that needs to be put back on organizations. How are you ensuring that these conversations are bias free and that they are fair? Because if you're not doing that, this is the outcome. People being called greedy, not feeling loyal, maybe, thinking, oh, this isn't the place I want to work, and looking to go elsewhere.
And there's a good chance you would think then those managers that are saying, making those comments, actually, I'm sure that, it's quite possible that on their values and mission statement of that business, they would promote their psychologically safe working environments. But actually, if you don't feel psychologically safe in asking for a pay increase or a pay review or whatever it might be, then actually you're not quite living those values. I think there's a lot of human psychology in this process, irrespective of gender pay gaps or ethnicity pay gaps or anything else. I think sometimes people just feel threatened when other individuals might be earning the same as them. And typically you have to look upward to get that shift. You have to go up to a manager, and they don't always individually want that gap closed for their own egos.
Yes.
And I think, again, that's a really interesting, a completely different potential problem to overcome. But that kind of links back to, you've got to look inward to awaken. You've got to look inside and go, actually, this is not about my ego here. This is about whether I want to have the time and the resources and all the things that's going to impact me if that person was to go. Yes, it might close the gap between my pay and theirs. Okay. But how does that really matter to you? We run individual lives. And if it means that you get to go at the time you want to go to be with your kids at the end of the day, does it really matter that the gap's closed? Because if you lose that individual, I can tell you now, you're going to be interviewing, spending time recruiting, spending your budget, and all those things that go with it. And again, it's short-term thinking. But I do think there's a lot of, I find it fascinating because there is a human psychological element to pay. And I think that's it makes that challenge for experts like yourself, Michelle, I think that little bit more complicated. But we're going to open the HR L&D Vault in just a moment. I just want to find out if there's anything else you'd like to add. You're an expert in this space. There may be a question that you think, oh, surprised he didn't ask me this, because in the world right now, this is really prevalent, or maybe not. But if there's anything I've missed or anything you'd like to raise awareness for our listeners, either in the work that you do or what's happening in the market right now, I wondered if I can put it back on you to say, here's your opportunity to say, actually, it'd be worth your listeners taking away this.
Yeah, so there's 2 things. I think the first one is around the fact that, we've had pay gap reporting now since 2017. And if you were to believe the kind of media sensationalist headlines, they would tell you that we've made no progress whatsoever. But my take is that, well, 2 things. One, yes, we have made progress. If you look at, the kind of the data, you will see that there have been drops. But the biggest kind of shift in approach to this that I am seeing, and I've been championing for quite some time, and I think it's starting to kind of pick up is that there is always more than one way to measure what success looks like. We have been sold this idea that success only looks like your pay gap figure dropping year on year consistently, when we know that it fluctuates for people. It can stagnate, it can go up, it can go down, because, it's influenced by so many different things. And what I'm seeing increasingly, and what I say to clients all of the time, is that yes, you can measure your pay gap because that's what you have to do, but you should always be looking for alternative measures of success. So what does success look like for you in your organization? So it could look like you have an increase in the number of people who take up shared parental leave, for example. It could look like you have an increase in the number of women that have, gone into leadership roles within the organization. It could look like that you have strengthened your remote working policy now, and, your employees are much more engaged and much more happy. Those things may or may not impact on your gender pay gap figure, but they are still measures of success. And so I really want organizations to understand that you don't just have to look at your pay gap figure to define whether you've been successful or not. There are other things that you can put into place as well that are just as important. And you should be loud about those successes as well. Because most people, when they're looking at an organization's pay gap, and I read this stat the other day, it said that 55% of women would still apply for a role within an organization that had a high gender pay gap if they could show what they were doing to address the root causes.
Nice.
So
okay.
Provided you are vocal about that, you're always communicating about those things, you can still attract that talent. You can still retain that talent, but you have to be open about what else you are doing. Because I think we're reaching that point where people understand, okay, yeah, I get the pay gap figure. I understand what it is and why it's there, but what are you doing? What do you offer? Yeah, if I was to come and work for you, what are you doing? How are you working on reducing that? And it's those conversations.
We want to work with the progressive organizations, right? And everyone's got weaknesses in their armory, no matter who we are. No one is perfect, and no organization is perfect either. But you want to see progression. You want to see commitment and progression.
Exactly.
So I understand that.
You have to, and I think a lot of organizations have shied away from that because they think, oh, it's just about the pay gap figure. It isn't. And that's why I've called my podcast Beyond the Pay Gap Figure, because it's not just about that number. It's about all of the things that make up that number. So do that detective work and be very vocal about what it is that's happening within the organization, as well as what's happening with your pay gap figure.
Fantastic. Well, listen, let's open the HR L&D vault. So these are just 3 short, sharp questions for sort of 1-2 word answers. Just have a bit of fun. First one is this. If you had one piece of advice, Michelle, that you could give to the world, what would it be?
I think it would be to slow down and think about things. We live in a world where everything is like instant and so fast that it can be easy to misconstrue things or to miss things. So for me, it'd be just to kind of just slow down just a little bit and think things through before you take actions or say things or make decisions.
Love that. And I couldn't agree more. So I listened to, or I watched rather a documentary recently, and the individual on the documentary, I can't record his name, so my apologies, said that he wants to run a social experiment. And he said, I want to go into a restaurant and I want to just monitor all the couples that are at the restaurant. But the minute one of them goes to the loo, how quickly it is that the individual that's left at the table gets out their phone.
I knew you were going to say that.
Well, we are obsessed with distraction. We're obsessed with, not being able to actually sit by ourselves for a moment and just reflect and think, or even hold a conversation. And I think that's really important. Slow down to speed up sometimes. This constant distraction is a problem. And actually we need to be a little bit more conscientious in the way that we, when we have the opportunity to take that moment, let's take it rather than be distracted by it. So I love that response. Second question, if you had the opportunity, what advice would you give to a younger you just starting out in this new world of work?
I would get a mentor. I didn't have one. And so I basically was navigating the world of work on my own. And I suspect that I probably missed out on kind of professional development opportunities earlier. And I had a friend who did have a mentor. And when I look at her career progression, I think, oh, she probably really benefited from having somebody, further ahead, advising her. So yeah, younger me, I'd get a mentor.
Fantastic. Couldn't agree more. I have a coach. I work as an executive coach and mentor as well. So if anyone needs advice, you can contact me at nick@t4mcoach.com, which is a little shameful plug there, but I don't think I've ever mentioned it in 120, 180 odd episodes. So there you go. You've given me the opportunity, Michelle. So thank you for that. And last but not least, what is the sort of one guiding principle behavior you've seen in every great leader that you've worked with?
Oh, yeah. So the first thing that came to mind was, and I'm thinking of a particular leader. Now, this is something that I look out for, is somebody who trusts their people and gives them autonomy to do the role. And I'm speaking from experience. I've had, some leaders who have not been so great and others who have been great. But the greatest one that I ever had was somebody who just trusted me implicitly that I would figure things out, that I'd be able to do the job, I'd be able to, come up with new innovative ideas, and that sense of freedom to just try things out, even if I wasn't sure, was a real confidence boost to me. And as a result, I would have done anything for her because she was just the best leader I've ever had. So yeah, a leader that trusts their people and gives them autonomy to do their role, I think is one of the best leadership qualities there are.
Love that. Well, I know that Stephen Covey would agree with you. He's obviously wrote The Speed of Trust. It's a show that I recorded with him about a year ago. So if you're interested in trust, do check that out as well. Plug number 2, here you go. A previous episode of the HR L&D podcast with Stephen Covey, where he does talk about trust being the central premise to great leadership. And I think actually it's a fantastic episode. It really is. And obviously he's sold 2 million copies of his book, and a lot of people believe the same thing. But you're not alone in that summation. So yeah, really great point. Well, look, for those that have really enjoyed today's show, please do check out Michelle's website. It's equalitypays.co. I will, of course, put a link in the show notes directly. I want to give a huge thank you, of course, to Michelle Gyimah for joining me today, sharing her expertise on the importance of pay transparency plans for HR directors. Big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning into the show. Don't forget, you can follow us on YouTube as well as sort of this on your download on your favorite podcast platform. But the YouTube interviews like today, you can actually see us in real person. You can see the interviews live as we record them. So do check out our YouTube channel. I will put a link in the show notes for that as well. And of course, we're here to really help you generate more insights that can allow you to run your HR functions more effectively. So if you have any particular subject areas you'd like me to cover in a future episode, please do get in touch. Or indeed, if you need support recruiting top HR talent, well, that's where my team can come in as well. And you can reach either myself or any of my wonderful organization employees at www.jgarecruitment.com. Just let me say one huge more thank you to Michelle for joining me today. I look forward to bringing you the next episode of the HR L&D podcast real soon. Michelle, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Today's episode of the HR L&D podcast is sponsored by Deal, the all-in-one global people platform that simplifies how you manage the entire global team lifecycle. From contractors, direct employees, EOR, and more, you can manage them all in one place with Deal. Hire and onboard talent in over 150 countries in minutes, or run payroll in over 100 countries with just one click. Offer competitive benefits, equipment, and equity from a single dashboard. Even customize career roadmaps, performance assessments, and more for your team through Deal's suite of AI-powered learning and development tools. So no matter your global business goals, Deal's team of over 200 legal experts keeps you compliant with local laws every step of the way. So whether you're an enterprise business, a small company, or something in between, Deal is built to meet your unique global HR needs. Ready to transform your global HR? Click the link in the show notes to book a demo with Deal today. That's DEEL.